And we're live. Okay. Okay, everybody. It's been 2 weeks, I think, and we're just continuing this our sort of series here on Hegel, continuing through the self-consciousness section. Um, I think last time I know we stopped at page 10. I do think I read uh, these two paragraphs. I don't know if should I read it again just in okay, maybe I will. I'll read, and it'll help refresh our memory.
What page is this?
Uh, this is page 10.
I think we read all of page 10.
Did we? Okay.
Hold on. Let me go through this.
Yeah.
Okay. Whatever. Let's just read the whole thing again.
Yeah. Just
That might be
better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
Alrighty. If one self-consciousness kills the other, it also brings the death of itself in doing so, since the recognition is now no longer possible and self-consciousness no longer has a way by which to solicit itself, so that it can truly exist as self-consciousness. As we have established, self-consciousness, in order to be so, must be recognized by another, and it must see that this recognition is of itself and that the other self-consciousness recognizes this recognition. This shows that its identity is self-contained and exists as its own term in the relation for another, and as its own term within that relation is truly itself and self-contained. The killing of the other does not sustain self-consciousness, rather it collapses it, since its basis for existing is no longer there. If self-consciousness truly wants to sustain it, it is necessary that the other self-consciousness must live and is not denied, so that way it can have its existence as truly its own term and relation, which is also part of its existence as the being for another of its own being in itself. Once death occurs, so does the once death occurs, so does the desire to be other, since otherness requires an other to be other from, and this truth is mediated through another self-consciousness which has true independence. We can say the essence of self-consciousness is twofold: to be its own awareness of itself, and furthermore to have itself in relation to another, which is aware of it as its own self. If the latter is denied, then the awareness of itself is undermined, since it has no means by which it can explicitly call itself independent, as even its own objects would be passive and not explicitly contrasting themselves with the subject, which can just take it for itself. Now, I do believe we did read that, but I don't know if you remember this. Last time we were talking, we sort of kind of like went into, and this is a little bit beyond like the scope of the text, but it's related logically to it. We spoke about like why, the otherness cannot simply just be the passive object. That actually has to be a real distinct self-consciousness from itself. And I was sort of giving you some of my own thinking in terms of responses to that. I came up with another one shortly after as to why you can't logically have just one self-consciousness in existence, and that there necessarily needs to be multiple. Firstly, I would say this: for any particular, there is a universal, right? But for something to be universal, it necessarily must manifest itself in particularity. But a particular can only be a particular so long as it is an individual particular amongst many particulars of itself, so to speak. Now you may push back and you might say, well, can't it just be a particular amongst other distinct particulars? Like, a particular chipmunk is distinct from a particular rock, but they're both particulars in their own sense. And while that is true, it's actually a little bit more complicated, because in order to say this specific self-consciousness, you need to come to that with an understanding of what self-consciousness is, as something that can actually be predicated through time and have a stable sense of identity. And in doing so, that necessarily implies differentiation of the self same thing from another thing with the same qualities. Like, you couldn't talk about a tree unless there was first of all, you understood the universality of a tree, of course, but also the fact that like a singular tree is only this singular thing so long as there's other singular things of its own likeness through which allows it to be a singular thing. So the singularity in a concrete sense also implies the multiplicity in a concrete sense, so to speak. That was also a conclusion I kind of came to when thinking this through. Um, and Yeah, so like even if someone wanted to take the radical position that, well, what if it's just universal, but it instantiates itself in a singular, like in just one particular instead of multiple particulars? Well, then I would say, well, even to be one particular in a concrete sense, to have that likeness, in order for that to logically be the case, uh, to point to it and say this likeness, it must actually have something concretely in common with other likenesses in the world to be so. If it didn't, then it would kind of collapse into something that's unintelligible, I would argue. Um,
But
so,
what if that's just the way you choose to think about it?
well, I mean, well, of course, like the way every truth claim that we make is in some sense the way we choose to think about it. I mean, there's exceptions to that, of course, because certain things like you can only think about it in a certain way, right? Like if I told you to speak of nothingness, well, when you speak of or think of nothingness, you're giving it being, so you're not thinking, you can't think about it as it really is because it isn't anything. um so there's like certain ways in which our mind must think logically, or or is forced into thinking. Now somebody might say, well, this means that we can't say anything about the world. Or it's funny because Hegel addresses this problem in the introduction, and I think like Hegel's response to this is also similar to Bradley's response regarding like the question of if we can think about the absolute, and Hegel's kind of talking about the same thing. And they would sort of respond, well, we have to work with what we got, because there's nothing else we can do. Could we be wrong? Certainly, but it would be it would be coherently the case that based off what we have, this is what we would take to be true at a certain element.
Did Hegel believe that all matter was of one substance?
Well, Hegel would say, for instance, in the what is it, the philosophy of history, there's a famous quote from the introduction of that book, where he says, matter is that which has its essence outside of itself. It is not free. Spirit is that which has its essence self-contained, which is ultimate freedom. So basically, because matter in its particularity always refers to something outside of itself to be a particular, because a particular inherent to particularity is it being itself and not something else. So it has inherent distinction, well, proper to its own identity, meaning that because it has that, it's also contingent upon something outside of itself, which is why its essence is outside of itself. So Hegel would say that matter is not, well, he would say it's not even like, it's just a phenomenon of spirit's externalization. It's not really anything prime, or well, your question was it of one substance? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Like when you say that, do you just mean that like matter has the same essence in all instances? Are you talking about like matter as such? I guess you must
Well,
be.
like I was more thinking like the physical aspect, like in physics, where if you go down to like the subatomic level, eventually, like things stop being unique. Like because so like like uh, uh, like a bowl of glass isn't necessarily like fundamentally different from a rock or something. It's just
Right.
subatomic particles, and particles rearranged in a different way and under different conditions.
Yeah, I
Uh,
see what you're
and
saying.
like even if you go down to like elemental differences in chemistry, like eventually once you get down to like the most minute level, things start to look the same.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, he probably wouldn't deny that. I think he would probably just say, well, that's just sort of like, at a certain point you get to like a specific, because that's still a qualia, right? That you're pointing to there. And he would say, well, that qualia or quality, because it's one particular thing, would just be like another external manifestation of spirit, which is like, the its own sort of its substance is itself. basically. So I think I don't think there's an incompatible thing with idealism, because Hegel's sort of saying, well, yeah, no, but there is a multiplicity of phenomena. But the interesting thing with the sort of subatomic thing that you're talking about is like even if we compared two elements or whatever, the very fact that they're like, even though in terms of quality they're the same, they're still distinct from one another. There's something distinguishing them. That means like no matter which way you go, any particularity is still going to be distinct because it is a particular. There's always going to be something else there, um, right? So even if you take like two like self same units of matter, just the fact that they're two means they're distinct from one another. That means there's something else beyond them, and then so on, and then so on, and then so on. Um, and
Why does the distinction imply that something else must be beyond them? Like, why does Hegel introduce this concept of spirit? Like, how's that not made up? Like, how does he deduce this stuff?
well, because logically speaking, if there are two terms in a relation, the two terms are distinct, right? But if they are distinct, that means there is something outside both of them that they do not contain necessarily, but are also necessarily pointing to, so to speak. So,
Is
you
it
know,
is it like the mere perception of the differentiation of the two units implies that like there's some kind of like movement in the subject which implies spirit? Is
well,
that
it would no, it's more than that. It's also just like the logical sort of reality. Like if you say that there's like two of these things, right? You're saying that each one of those things are distinct from each other, right? Because if they weren't, it would be one thing, right? Uh, and in doing so, that means that in order for them to be two distinct things from one another, they also have to be contrasted with something else outside of themselves, right? Either it's other sort of self same thing that's distinct from it, or the space around it. If we're talking about space, um, it's contour, right? Like a one unit is going to be contoured from another unit, or is going to have a contour against the space in which it exists from another unit, which also shares the same identity, that also has that same contour, and is also going to exclude the other thing from itself, but also inherently relate to that other thing um, logically. So it's more so of just like this is a logical necessity that cannot be escaped.
is the relation contained in the thing itself or the subject who's perceiving the thing?
Well, both.
How is it contained in the thing in itself?
Because an object is, if it's a particular thing, is inherently, first of all, in the fact that it is distinct, that says logically that it is not something else and is itself. But in saying that it is not something else, that means it presupposes something else, right, outside of itself, which is therefore the inherent nature of its uh, relational essence, so to speak. That's why
So
Hegel.
Hegel believes that the object can only be described properly by what it is not rather than by what it is.
No, not necessarily. He would say both. You could say both things. So he says, in
But
previous.
is the apophatic approach superior to the positive approach?
I don't think. Well, it's not superior in the sense that it tells us more. It would just be like a sort of more developed way of looking at things, I suppose.
Well, I mean that is kind of like more developed implies superiority, right?
Well, it would imply superiority of.
Refinement. It would imply refinement of thinking to get
Yeah,
grasp at like what the reality really
it
is.
would
Right?
it would imply superiority of of like thought development, but it wouldn't imply superiority in the sense of like one is more true than the other, is what I'm saying. So like it's like you could still just as truthfully say that, well, this thing has all of its particular qualities, and that's just as true as saying, well, this thing is also not this and is distinct from this and that and whatever. Like they're both equally true. Just one is sort of more of a developed, more matured, if you will, way of looking at the same thing. Um, so here's like a I guess a really easy way of explaining this. when you're a kid, right? Like you come into contact with a glass of water, right? It's like, okay, well, it's just this weird liquid thing that I drink that makes me feel hydrated. Um, but then you go to like high school and then you take chemistry class and then you learn the chemical structure of water is H2O. But in doing so, now it's not to say that like, well, it's not true that water is like a liquid or whatever. It's just that, knowing it as H2O is just a sort of a more developed way of looking at the same thing. But both of those things would be true. Like its appearance and the way it feels and its relation to you, its substance or whatever,
Mm.
is just as true as the fact that it is its chemical structure.
Well, the reason I'm asking questions about this is because the apophatic approach, describing things by what they're not, is very counterintuitive. You have to actually force yourself to do it. At least for me, that's what I found.
I agree with you. It takes more effort because it's not immediate, right?
Mm.
And that's why it's counterintuitive. Because when you're faced with like the immediacy of a object, whether it be like in perception or in thought, it's easy to say, well, this thing, like a book that I'm picturing in my head, okay, well, it's red, it's got white pages, and okay, that's pretty straightforward. But it's a little bit more difficult to say, well, okay, it's not purple, it's not green, the pages are not black, and they are softer than the cover, and the cover and the pages are this. Like, that's more. It takes more labor to do that. So yeah, you're correct in saying that. I would agree. And
It
so
takes even more labor to extrapolate this apophaticism to
yes,
spirit,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
and then like Hegel takes you like all these like this labyrinth of language that he uses to
Yeah,
describe the, like dialectical relations between objects.
yeah, and like one thing I think I may have mentioned this before, but like I'll bring it up again because it is relevant. When you go through like these chapters, you'll start to notice, like he'll give you. I mean, I think you've also commented on this. He'll give you something. He'll say this is the case, and he'll like destroy it in front of you, and
Yeah.
then he'll be like, okay, well now it's this. Oh, I'm going to destroy it again. But then in the end, you do end up with something, and then you move on to the next thing, and that happens until you get to absolute knowing. But and it could be annoying when you don't, because
But
nobody.
he never gets to absolute knowing.
Yes, he does. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, like, if he did, then like German idealism would be complete, right? And German idealism is infamously incomplete.
Well,
He didn't complete the system.
I mean, maybe if you talk to Cantbot,
Hegel
but
couldn't do it. Fichte couldn't do it.
he of course Hegel would argue, no, I did do it, but well, I mean, we'll see. I mean,
But how? No, like surely, like what Hegel is claiming to be absolute spirit cannot be defined in any intellectual human work. Surely that is the case.
Well, it can't
Because
be.
he claims infinity, right? That's impossible to fully intellectually articulate by definition.
It's fully impossible to articulate in the sense that like, because if to do so, you would sort of resort to like picture thinking or like static notion or whatever, like a static idea. And he says that explicitly, but he also says that like, well, it is like we can know the fact that we can know the way in which it operates logically, but we can't like grasp it in its fullness the way we could grasp an object because it's beyond all objects. So, it's it's the undergirding of every particular object that exists and moves. So yeah, you're correct in saying it's not a final state. Hegel says it's like, well, it's the process as such, that even the word process or the phrase process as such can't give you the fullness of, um, in a sense. But he says it must exist because of all the other things that we know exist, and that's why we can sort of predicate of it in in a certain, in some ways a positive manner, but in many ways a negative manner. It's especially because its essence is negativity in a way. But we should probably keep going here because we haven't even gotten through the first page. But yeah, by the way, so I think we'll just go to page 20 here, and then we'll have like 12 more pages left, and we can just do that later this week. Anyway, Self consciousness is now beyond the first mediated I and has become relational to another self consciousness in its development. This is its next unfinished mediated state. This relation is necessary for it to sustain itself, and it does so by receiving recognition from it. The first self consciousness is for itself and is self same, and the second self consciousness through which it relates and receives recognition is for another, namely for the self consciousness that is for itself. Since it must relate to this other self consciousness for its identity and take from it, we now have the birth of the relation between Lord and bondsman. Both are juxtaposed, but in this juxtaposition, they feed into one another and for each other, and this is not yet understood to be at a higher level a real unity. Okay, so now we're really getting into the sort of the second uh, movement here, which also will have multiple movements contained within. Uh, anyway, since the bondsman has for his object work or labor, he is confronted with his own self in the work he produces, and the work is therefore a reflection of his being for self, which, as permanent reflection of this, he can relate to in a negative manner, negative in the sense that he is distinct from the object he produces. This is contrasted with the Lord, who merely enjoys the fruits of the labor produced by the bondsman, and thus the Lord has a fleeting enjoyment of objects, but never actually comes to know himself through them. Work is the halting or fleeting desire in favor of expression of self-consciousness in what it produces, which allows for a richer sense of self-consciousness for the bondsman, since he knows himself through his work and his relation to its existence in the object. It is through the existence of the object produced by the self-consciousness of the bondsman uh, that he can contrast himself with a permanent representation of himself, and therefore knows himself as an independent self which is reflected in the permanent object of his work. The labor in itself is his own activity, which he knows himself in and through. Since this activity is proper to him, it is how he exists as his own determinate thing. So, so he's introducing something very interesting here. Uh, in the Lord and bondsman or master slave sort of dynamic or dialectic, you have a sort of richer sense of self consciousness seen in the bondsman. The reason that's the case is because the bondsman sees himself reflected in his labor. When he produces, when I produce a YouTube video, I can look at that and say, hey, that's, me sort of crystallized in a little permanent thing, a video or whatever. Or if I build a couch, I know that couch could only exist because I brought it into existence, so to speak. Because part of its existence is the fact that I brought it into existence. And by that fact, that means I exist. And my own self is once again revealed in that logical truth. So the bondsman, because of this truth, has a superior sense of self-consciousness, whereas the Lord, he's never doing any reflecting, so to speak, at least in this relationship. Maybe he does it elsewhere, but as far as this relationship is concerned, he isn't, because he simply just receives things from others. He kind of just passively enjoys them. It's kind of the same reason why if anyone who watches the channel, I'm kind of just realizing this now, but it's true. The reason I've always been so against the identification with consumption is because, well, what you are consuming is not you; it's distinct from you, and in being distinct from you, but also not reflecting you in the sense that it's not something you brought into being, in which your true independent self is shown in. You actually don't. You actually sacrifice the ability to understand yourself because you're not relating to something that actually reveals your true, distinct, independent nature within. And this relationship is really present in anything. I think the reason, people are attached to their children in many ways is not just merely because they produce them, but also just like in the act of raising them, you sort of see yourself in doing so as well. When you bring a child, when you help them develop, and they recognize you doing that too, You begin to sort of see yourself in them. The way the way you treat them affects how they are, and you say to yourself, "Oh, I did that. I made them this way." You know, a funny example, I guess, could be like when Snout would rage bait me. In doing that, he sees himself reflected in my rage directed back at him, so to speak, right? I mean, so this sort of truth is always present in anything you're interacting with as a distinct self consciousness.
Can we go back a little bit and
Yeah.
explore why, like, what purpose is Hegel pursuing when he personifies, like, what is being personified in Master and Bondsman? Is this like an internal process of consciousness?
Well, it's both internal and external. It's the Lord and Bondsman relationship specifically. Now, remember how, like, prior to this, we were talking about how self consciousness must relate to another self consciousness. It is from this that we get the Lord and slave sort of.
Yeah. So it's like it starts off as an intersubjective thing.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
Mhm.
But its consequences are subjective, as we'll see here.
So
Um,
what? Okay. So he. I mean, like, what does he explain like particular examples of how this is carried out, how this intersubjective dynamic is
yeah.
manifested?
Oh yeah, no, we're gonna get into like a whole like development here in a minute. It almost sort of reads like a story in a certain respect. Is That's how I felt when I was reading it. Um, like well, I guess have to show you. But
Go ahead.
yeah, hold on, I'm just gonna turn. That's not my fire alarm battery or anything. I'm just turning the heat on.
Yeah, it's a smoke alarm. He forgot to replace the smoke
Yeah,
alarm batteries
yeah.
because he's black.
Yeah. That's the hidden truth about Gabriel Sprock. Um, I should do that. I should just convince people that's what I am. That'd be funny. Anyway, um, the Lord is the independent self consciousness, or the self which has being for itself. But this is only realized insofar as he mediates himself through the bondsman. In order for Lord to be Lord, he must be Lord over something, and therefore his identity as such is by virtue of the bondsman. He exists for himself through his relation to the bondsman. He receives himself back through the negative relation of his self consciousness with that of the other. The distinction is necessary for this identity to occur and for this relation to occur. The Lord is his own independent thing distinct from the bondsman, but part of his distinction is the necessary relation to the bondsman, which is for himself and necessary for him to be Lord. He has his own distinct being, but uh, his own distinct being that is truly self same, but it can only be so insofar as it relates for another, in relation through which the distinction or independence is realized. So the Lord is therefore related to both himself and his external relational being, through which his nature of distinct role can exist. However, the Lord is However, the Lord is relational. No, However, the Lord is also truly his own thing, which subjects the bondsman to himself. And as a term, he must exist before the relation between the two can. But it is also the case that this relational existence is also its essence, since without it he is no longer Lord. But he must also have thinghood to be related to another distinct thing to begin with. So he is for himself and for another. And this is the essence of every distinct thing for Hegel. Anyway, but this second aspect is the reinforcement of the identity of the first. It is the active reality of the first, which its existence in mediation is necessary for it. The Lord, through his subjugation of the bondsman, enjoys the fruits of the dependent reality of the bondsman. The bondsman sacrifices his own independence in favor of the Lord, and he works on and for him. The Lord is independent, and the bondsman is too, but like the Lord is necessarily related to the other to have its distinct independent existence. So he cannot annihilate the Lord, or else he'd lose his identity as well. He therefore surrenders his independence and sees himself as having being for another. The Lord finds satisfaction in his recognition through the bondsman and achieves what desire never could, because the Lord allows the distinction to be so that he can have his identity. However, he simply only enjoys the truth of the bondsman depending on him and doesn't yet know he too is relational. So, a lot of things here. The Lord basically, of course, in order to be Lord, must be Lord over something, and that's why the bondsman must exist. Uh, and the bondsman, of course, recognizes this at first because it's immediate. Okay, well, this guy is sort of my master, so to speak, and my existence is inherently in my subjugation to him, related to him, and the bondsman knows this. Uh, and he accepts this, of course. And the reason this is known is because it's explicit, right? If you sort of you transgress the bondsman, maybe or sorry, if you transgress the Lord, maybe he would beat you or something. Um, However, because the Lord has this authority over the bondsman, and because his sort of recognition as Lord is kind of firstly immediate, he doesn't know that he too is sort of dependent on the bondsman. He doesn't see the fact that he's not like he wouldn't be Lord without the bondsman. Therefore, he has his essence outside of himself as well, and he's not truly free in the way he thinks he is. Um, so that's sort of the beginning where we begin to see this there's a discrepancy here. Um, and this sort of dynamic here is somewhat related to what we spoke about before, where when the two self-consciousnesses come into interaction for the first time, because they're so dead set on having their independence, they will try to one up each other.
I think actually this is a lot more useful for understanding objects like being fundamentally relational than like your autistic ramblings about like staring at a dry wall. Like,
Yeah, well, the reason I had to go through those autistic ramblings is because that's like sense certainty. This makes this is much more easier to grasp because this is like more sort of how our concrete reality is. But
yeah, because I mean, a lord is in itself a social relation. So like, I
yeah,
mean, it's not like a concrete object. Like you can't, you cannot like point to kingship
well,
unless it exists.
well,
In
you
terms of it like being concretely manifested in the material world.
I would disagree with that though, because if in being a social relation, it is concretely present. Now, it's not concrete in the sense that like it has like well, it does have a physical manifestation, but it's not like concrete in the sense that like you can touch kingship as a relation, of course, but like the relation itself between king and subject in the social world, it has like actual.
Yeah, it has a concrete manifestation, but in itself, it is it is ethereal.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's like power,
It's
right?
well, yeah, like you did that video on powers, so
Yeah.
you will understand this.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. It's not it's concrete, but not in the way that like a brick is concrete. It has like a sort of it manifests itself in concrete reality, but also like the thing in itself, so to speak, is as you say, ethereal or abstract as well. Which
Yeah, so is Hegel trying to like use this sort of like inherently relational these inherently relational terms, these titles, as a way to start thinking about like objects in general, rather like it's so like the relationship of between lordship and bondsman is present in any object of perception, albeit in the muted form.
um well the truth of the relation, yes, but he is also like commenting on the actual Lord and Bonds. Like he's also commenting on the unique aspects of it as well. Like, because this is also we're concerned here with self consciousness, and he's saying that like, well, self consciousness it's underdeveloped when it doesn't know it's the fact that it has to relate to another self consciousness. A sort of prime example of this is the sort of one-sided narcissistic relation between those who hold power and those who are subject to power. And so he's showing that like there's a discrepancy here that that is a sort of sign of underdevelopment in consciousness. And so he's pointing to this to show the necessity of relation um,
Mm.
in self consciousness toward another self consciousness. But also, what he's saying here, like you said, does apply to everything in existence as well.
Well,
Um,
it could be. I mean, like if you were to apply this to history, this could be a metaphor for the development of feudalism, uh, from like
yeah,
late Roman manorialism to like the Germanic barbarians take over, and they're basically act as like despotic warlords. And then later on, like they start developing concepts like chivalry and noblesse oblige, which is
yeah,
less narcissistic, like more
yeah.
pro-social.
And the reason that's the case is because they get well, they begin to recognize their direct and necessary relation with otherness. Maybe not like explicitly, right? Maybe they don't use terms like that or think in those ways, but like they subconsciously know, right? It's kind of why um, I hate to bring this up because I don't want to. It's gonna sound like I'm digressing, but uh, you'll see people who talk about like, well, like we don't need like rules of engagement or like Geneva suggestions or whatever. It's like, but you like they want to like they hate on that and they think it's like gay or something. But the truth is that like well actually like those like having war like an understanding of war crimes and like recognition of like rules of engagement shared by both parties is actually a sign of progress and development in the history of self-consciousness of humanity. Um, you know, and those things came about because the discrepancies were recognized throughout history. Um, and right wingers would probably hate that I said that, but it's true. Um, and you begin to see, and so like this truth, right, that he's pointing to, it's seen everywhere. This is like Marxists. This is when they talk about Hegel. This is the first thing they think about. Um, but they apply this logic to they apply this logic to proletariat and bourgeoisie, right? It's the same sort of
Yeah,
thing.
it's like reverse class conflict in a way,
Yeah,
where the ruling class becomes more humane because of its relationship to the lower class.
yeah, exactly. And then like they'll say that like, well, the fact that like the ruling class needs this lower class means that like the lower class is actually producing the value in society and therefore has the moral right to sort of control society because of the fact that they produce society.
Yeah,
That,
maybe this is like could be like a bedrock for like a political manifestation of right Hegelianism right
Oh
there.
yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, if you look into like fascist, like Italian fascist thinking, there's like this is kind of a basis for class collaboration in a sense. Like all the classes need each other to operate, and therefore they should recognize each other and work together. You know, um,
So Giovanni Gentile directly relates this Lord Bondsman dialectic,
I don't. Well,
class collaboration.
I wouldn't be surprised if he did, but
Oh, you have not read the Doctrine of Fascism?
no, I've read the Doctrine of Fascism, but
Uh,
he doesn't specifically use this example in it.
okay.
There's
Well,
also
I mean, like obviously, I mean, it is implicitly the case if it is mentioned.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Um, and 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 by the way, I need to just and you also by the way you saw stuff like this, and you and I have talked about this. I think in like private calls about like the sort of like guild system being like a proto version of this kind of stuff back in the Middle Ages. Uh,
Mhm.
this is I don't know how anybody could argue against this without basically admitting to being like narcissistic and not or being misanthropic to some degree. It's like this is pretty like much irrefutable to me, but I don't want to like get into that right now. It's just a personal opinion.
Well,
So
what you got to do is like you got to get into like analytic philosophy and positivism, and you got to be like a rootless like Anglo-American capitalist, and like become a CEO of Palantir, so you can have your own like goy slaves in a
yeah,
private city.
welcome back, Ayn Rand.
Yeah,
Yeah. So well, and this
maybe
is
against this.
and this is why like I'm just like the Nietzsche stuff. Okay, I'm gonna Gabriel Sprock, go one day without shitting on Nietzsche is challenge impossible. But it's like I don't like. I cannot really like get behind the Nietzsche stuff. Not even like for like moral reasons or anything particularly, but just because it's like, well, like you are like sustaining this sort of discrepancy, and like maybe my mind just hates like disharmony, and I like desire to like see it resolved into a unified whole. That's why I hate it, and it drives me. It's like an OCD thing almost, philosophically speaking, for me.
Well,
Um,
to be fair, I mean, like Nietzsche, I mean, like in his dialectic of master and slave, I mean, this was a dialectic where, uh, his whole concept of the Übermensch wasn't actually like pure master morality. Like it was a mixing of like the master and the slave morality together to form a superior hybrid
Right. Well,
philosophy.
like a morality that knows how to like tarry with the lower morality and transcend it, but also integrate some of its aspects. So that way, because it's almost like a an
Yeah,
anti-fragile.
well, yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's the whole thing is like you have the moral refinement and the internal conscience
Yeah.
and scrutiny of the priest, but also like the capacity to exert your will.
And that's fair. That's fair. But
Um,
you know,
but like this is I mean like this is his conception of the Antichrist actually, and I think like actually this does have an apocalyptic significance because I mean the Antichrist will appear meek and humble and beneficent, but inwardly he will be absolutely self-centered and he will worship the devil and so
yeah,
on.
I could point to people that I feel are into that sort of or at least embody a certain personality similar to that. But what was I gonna say? The well, that's obviously like, see, and I do make this mistake a lot, but it's hard not to do it because Nietzscheans and Nietzsche, we have to remember these are two different things. Uh, sort of this like, oh, dominate everybody, will to power sort of things. Like, yeah, I get
Yeah,
it.
that's vulgar Nietzscheanism, to be
Yeah,
fair.
it's like I guess that goes hard if you're like, I don't know, you have the head that like Conor McGregor's like bashed in dysmorphic head. You think that shit's cool or something? I don't know. Anyway, all right, I'll just keep reading. The Lord receives his recognition through the bondsman, but this relationship is unequal. The Lord takes himself to be pure and essential, and the power that subjects others to himself as Lord, and therefore views the bondsman in a negative, unessential manner. The bondsman exists for the independence of the Lord and has no independence of his own in the eyes of the Lord. When the bondsman acts, he is acting as the Lord or for him. In other words, the will of the Lord is mediated in the bondsman, and the bondsman's action is really the Lord's and for him. The bondsman is taken to be unessential and nothing for the Lord, in the sense that the Lord thinks he doesn't need to exist, meaning the bondsman doesn't need to exist like the Lord does. The Lord, seeing himself as independent, should also extend toward the bondsman, and the bondsman should take himself as independent, but also dependent, just like the Lord should realize he is dependent on the bondsman for his identity to be distinct. Since this moment is lacking, the full unity of recognition cannot yet occur. It should also be mentioned the bondsman affirms his own identity by working for the Lord and not for himself, and that he also has determined existence as bondsman or as subject, and takes himself to be contingent. This reaffirms the unequal relation. I just want to pause there for a second as to uh, kind of get into the logic as to
So he
why.
has some self-esteem issues.
Yeah, he's a
Mm.
little bit. He needs to probably
He just needs to like get more confidence.
he needs to ascend.
Yeah.
He needs to maintain frame, as some may say.
He needs to
That,
give the Lord a firm handshake.
yeah, walk up straight with your shoulders back, type of thing. But the I want to kind of comment here on this little last note that I took because it might. Well, okay. Let me before I do that, let me say this. We saw in the prior chapter this sort of thing where like the unessential and the essential uh, sort of are. It's like this weird like for Hegel, like when he says unessential, he's saying that kind of tongue in cheek in the sense that like, well, what is considered unessential, the relational aspect, is actually essential. So it's not it's sort of like, oh well, the fact that like I'm related to Snout here on the call, it seems sort of like coincidental or unessential to my own identity, myself. But the truth is that like my own particular identity essentially, therefore necessarily, is relational to Snout because well, Snout exists and I'm related to everything else that exists, just as he is related to everything else that exists.
Yes, and you're the Lord and I'm the bondsman because you forced me to sit through all of this.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
see, I'm a different kind though. I'm like I'm a noble lord,
of course.
you know,
I
which
would
is
never. I wouldn't dare question otherwise.
but so that I just want to make that clear. But also I'm by the way, by make that clear, I don't mean that, that I'm the noble lord. It's just the unessential essential relation. But this last
I'm
little
a merciful God.
yeah, the uh this last sort of sentence here I kind of want to comment on because it seems a little subtle, but it's important. Where I said it should all, I forgot to put the it, sorry. It should also be mentioned the bondsman affirms his own identity by working for the Lord and not for himself. And that he has also determined, and also has determined existence as bondsman or as subject and takes himself to be contingent. This reaffirms the unequal relation. So the fact that the bondsman doesn't really take himself to be independent and purely relational is kind of the opposite problem of the Lord. Whereas the Lord doesn't see himself as relational whatsoever. He just sees himself as this independent thing, a being unto himself. The bondsman sees himself as sort of like, oh, I'm just like this thing that can't exist without my relation. But also like the relation itself gives rise to my existence. Not that I exist prior to the relation or with the relation on equal footing. So it's sort of like the bondsman has the inverted understanding that the Lord has. The Lord only recognizes his independence without recognizing his uh, necessary relational aspect, and the bondsman only recognizes his relational aspect without also recognizing his independence or distinctness as such.
Yeah.
So that's something that should be put.
Yeah, I really think this is moving towards an understanding of history
Oh
and,
yeah,
and the way social relations develop throughout history.
and this is this is it's gonna get much better too. This is like I
Mm,
had such a good time reading this chapter, much more than the other ones because they were so abstract. It was grating. But
mm.
anyway, the Lord takes the bondsman as his object, but it then becomes revealed that the object does not correspond to its notion or the concept the Lord holds of the bondsman as being unessential. The Lord, in his understanding that the bondsman needs him for its own identity, lets us realize that he too exists in and through this relation and is not as independent as he thought he was. He therefore begins to question his being for self as essential and realizes it too becomes unessential like it did in the bondsman. Lordship's essence now becomes inverted and realizes it is contingent, and the essence of the bondsman is now understood to have its own independence by virtue of the fact it gives the Lord his identity.
Sorry, can you go back a little bit? So, why does the Lord enter this phase of self-reflection? What happens?
Uh, so this, I kind of misspoke here. I'm glad you brought this up. It's a little bit of a mistake to say that like the Lord, will necessarily understand this. It's just sort of like the logical, like we are also understanding that like the Lord is necessarily this way in a way, but it is totally possible for the Lord to undergo this kind of sort of self-reflection. And I mean that's happened before, that's not like something that's out of the question. So that is a good
Oh,
clarification.
surely there's like an instigating event in which this occurs, like maybe like a peasant rebellion, or I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Well, that's a good, yeah, or like a peasant rebellion, or maybe, I like to think of it like this. I've always told people that, like, even a absolute dictatorship, like Stalin's like dictatorship, could never actually work unless there was mutual recognition between Stalin and the people, uh, in a certain regard. Because if the entire population of the USSR looked at Stalin as a joke, even if he had access to whatever, um, and then his own men looked at him as a joke, he couldn't actually influence them to follow him. you can only do that once you have recognition, because people like to talk about force all the time. Well, power, what is the sort of saying people have, that power comes from the barrel of a gun? I think that was Mao that said that, or maybe whatever, I don't know, but it's a common saying. It's a very reductionist and retarded way of looking at power, because even in order to get that barrel of the gun kind of situation to begin with, you need people who will be willing to do that for you, to enact your will. But in order for them to enact your will, you already have to have legitimacy and recognition that your will is something that should be acted in service of. And in order to do that, you have to have mutual recognition between Lord and bondsman. Now, of course, if you pull out a gun and rob somebody, it's different, right? But that doesn't actually translate to civilizational historical power on a grand scale. Even like a gang of bandits armed with guns, even if they were too abusive to the population, eventually something's going to happen to them where they're not going to, they're going to be seen as a threat and illegitimate and inevitably destroyed by somebody else who can sustain power better by allowing recognition or allowing mutual recognition. So, but yeah, like a revolt is a good example of that. That's why I say that, like, even the most totalitarian systems are inherently democratic. There's a certain level of democracy that's inevitable. And not,
Like what Thomas Hobbes says in the Leviathan about how, like, even a king can easily be killed if there was a conspiracy against the king, because
yes,
like assuming it's like, normative human beings, whole of body, like they can easily, like, get together and like stab him, like Caesar.
100%. Yeah, exactly. Like Caesar's a perfect example of that too, right? If he was truly recognized as having authority. Oh, I like to use this example. I live in New York, right? Well, if I go into New York City and I start saying I'm the mayor, people would say they probably think I'm on drugs, and they would laugh and walk away. But
yeah, well, I mean, like, I think, I mean, this points to like sort of like inherent egalitarianism within humanity, just based on like physical prowess
yes,
or mental fortitude. It's like it's at the end of the day, like you choose to submit
yeah,
uh,
you do,
to those in authority. If you
100%.
don't submit, then or like if the majority of people don't submit, then
Yeah.
you chop their head off.
And I say this, I won't go too much into this, but like in terms of like the political, because whatever, I'm a right winger, but uh, we, no matter what group is out for us and against us, it's kind of our fault for submitting at a certain point. We kind of are to blame. And now they will say that to us, but that doesn't mean we don't have the right to try and take that back. And saying it's our fault, we should have done better, let's do better. There's no contradiction in that whatsoever. That's something else that needs to be clarified. But anyway, let me just finish this chunk up here. I'm going to go actually reread this again, a little, like this piece right here. The Lord in his we should put that in quotes. The Lord, in quote, his understanding that the bondsman needs him for its own identity lets us realize that he too exists in and through this relation and is not as independent as he thought he was. He therefore begins to question his being for self as essential and realizes it too becomes unessential like it did for the bondsman. Lordship's essence now becomes inverted and realizes it is contingent, and the essence of the bondsman is now understood to have its own independence by virtue of the fact it gives the Lord his identity, and thus has its own necessary and essential existence that is related but also truly distinct. Both now have what they lacked in the previous moments. For the Lord, subjugation and or being for another, and for the bondsman, essentiality and true being for self. So the Lord one is pretty clear. The bondsman kind of gets his sense, so to speak, at least logically, of independence and distinction and true, actuality by virtue of the fact that the Lord can't exist without the bondsman. And the very fact that the bondsman is necessary for the relation uh, is affirms the true and actual independent or distinct identity of the bondsman, uh, that it does exist relationally, but also exists as its own term as well. So that's where they both receive what they were lacking before. Because as I was saying, before, the Lord was lacking the fact that he's relational, and the bondsman was lacking the fact that he is distinct. But in by virtue of the fact that both have the same aspects of being relational and distinct, they too end up getting what they were lacking prior. And this is sort of another movement here uh, in development. Continuing on here, this is important. The Lord instills fear in the bondsman, and the bondsman, in his fear of the Lord, begins to shape himself in the image of the Lord by conforming to his will. This was slightly mentioned before, by the way. I was saying that like the bondsman, or Hegel was saying, I should say, is working for in working for the Lord, uh, he is sort of affirming the independence of the Lord as well. That's kind of why the Lord, takes himself to be independent, because he's like, well, I'm making this person do my will. Therefore, my will is superior. I'm sort of my own thing, and the bondsman, because he isn't acting in accordance to his will, has no sense of self identity or distinction or independence. But anyway, and then but the full truth of this is seen in the fact that the Lord instills fear into the bondsman, and well, I'll just keep reading. In doing this, the bondsman no longer identifies with himself, but with the will of the Lord. He raises himself to pure negativity in the sense that he exists totally for the Lord. At this stage, the bondsman does not understand that implicit in this truth is his own independent self-consciousness, because it is the independent self that is fearful and confronting, yet it does not realize that this fear is its own being yet. However, this will later serve as the basis in which his own independence will be known through the bondsman's raising of itself to pure negativity. So he will see that he is his own. By pure negativity, what Hegel is saying that basically the fact that the bondsman is afraid, and in feeling his own fear, and feeling that that fear is proper to himself, uh, and in relation to the Lord, he begins to sort of understand that, like, oh, well, the Lord doesn't have this fear. I have this fear. But because this fear is mine, that means I am not him. But if I'm not him, that means I am my own person. And this is sort of like the beginning little genesis of his sort of sense of, oh, I have actual, I have my actual own identity, because I have something unique to myself that I feel and sense and is actual, that the
So
Lord doesn't.
does this fear eventually turn into resentment?
It could, but I don't really think he doesn't go into that here. But the reason the fear coming from the Lord is important is because the fact that like the Lord is instilling fear in him, and that he recognizes that this fear is his and not the Lord's, it sort of signals to him the beginning of the fact that, well, I truly am different from this person and have my own uniqueness. And in having my own uniqueness, I am myself. Um, and and yeah, I mean, in a way, you could argue that too, right? Because if somebody felt fear from because of a tyrant, it may cause them to say, "I'm tired of being afraid," and because I am afraid, I'm afraid because of this person ruling over me. It's going to cause me to now affirm my own self against this person who is trying to destroy me. So that is a legitimate conclusion somebody could come to from this. 100%. And I think you could see that all the time in history, right? I like to think of like a prison revolt sometimes. Like maybe there's just like a abusive guard staff, and the prisoners are tired of feeling afraid of, their abuse or whatever, and so they decide to throw a riot against the prison to sort of affirm their own identity and independence over and against the prison guard. Um, that's one way of looking at it, so to speak, or just any revolution you could point to. But anyway,
So what is the next stage after fear and
well,
recognition of the fear?
Well, we're going to get to that right now.
peculiar to the self.
Well, I mean, it's the beginning of the bondsman coming to know his own independence, which is right
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah, but what happens after that? What happens after he acknowledges his own independence?
Well, you're going to find out.
Okay, so
So,
yeah,
yeah.
that was me hinting you to continue reading.
Okay. Sorry. I'm a little out of it today. I apologize. The bondsman comes to know himself as independent in his work, which he finds himself present in as an activity of himself and representation of his own being. So we're sort of reiterating some things we spoke about before here. Unlike the Lord, uh, which only has his being in another that is in the bondsman, through which he receives identity as Lord. The Lord does not produce to the same degree that the bondsman does, so he therefore has a poor sense of self consciousness, as he has nothing to see himself in directly, unlike the bondsman does in his labor. The labor of the bondsman has a twofold aspect: fear and servitude. Fear is the abstract knowledge of the self in the bondsman. He knows he is afraid by his very existence of subjugation to the Lord. This fear is the knowledge of himself in relation. But this fear is only fully developed when he serves the Lord through his work. And it is through this work, which is a service, that he begins to know himself as his own mind that is distinct. Hence, this labor, which reflects his nature, must be outward and for the Lord, because if it is merely self-referential to the bondsman, it is nothing outside of himself that contrasts himself with as distinct, and has no basis to see himself as truly juxtaposed to the other, and therefore an independent thing, if he really is just doing it for himself. If this is the case, no distinction is present, and the basis for self consciousness is gone, since consciousness needs distinction from the other to be itself. But since self consciousness here is still immersed within servitude, it has only mastered a particular kind of being, but has not done. For the whole of being or the highest level of consciousness. So this is also important. When so fear is this kind of abstract knowledge of the self or independence of the bondsman, but that knowledge is only fully realized when he sees himself serving the Lord through his labor. And it's not enough for the labor merely to be sort of just like labor for himself, because if it was the labor for himself, he wouldn't see his being for another. He wouldn't see the fullness of himself in doing so, because you need the other to exist. So in creating goods and product for the Lord, he subconsciously knows, I guess you could say, that, well, this is for somebody else that is not me. But in that somebody else being not me, myself is implied. My true independent self is implied in that distinction, and therefore I begin to recognize my own independence in recognizing that my labor belongs to somebody else, because in belonging to somebody else, it is no longer merely just something that's purely self-contained in my existence. I get a richer understanding through the contrast of myself with the other, so to speak, because as we established, every particular thing needs that distinction.
Well,
Um,
the idea that a person becomes class conscious through the goods of his own labor, I think it reminds me of Marxism.
yeah. Well, Marx talks about like alienation from labor too, right?
Mm.
That's another thing to consider as well when talking about this. So let me just see. I
So
finished.
Hegel did talk about this kind of class consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially right, because this is
Proletarian. Well, I'm not sure about proletarian, but lower class consciousness.
yeah. Well, right, and like the lower class only knows they are the lower class by their relation. They can only be the lower class via relation, but they can also only relate insofar as they do have independent identity and distinct identity as well. But distinctness as such is relational. So it's like the two things, you can't have one without the other. It's neither sort of come first logically. They're just sort of like on the same level as well, so to speak.
Lord and Bondsman.
Yeah, but also just like having a distinctness and relation.
Yeah,
Um,
well, one necessitates the other.
yeah, exactly. So it's like in terms of logical order, neither is a horizontal sort of thing. It's not a vertical. sort of thing.
Yeah,
But
which is why like there's all this kind of like interdependence.
yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, and like some people kind of like have like a misunderstanding of this, like, and they start to believe. I think people like Deleuze believe this. I could be wrong about this, but like I've seen this idea where people think, oh well, the terms come to be by virtue of the relation. So they try to prioritize relation first and then terms, but that's nonsensical because you can't have a relation without first having the terms to be related. But the terms themselves, because they are terms, necessitate being relational. It's a it's a symbiotic thing, right? You know, um, the and for example, in just to hone, I know I've repeated myself a couple times, but you know, this is how you learn things, and just so the audience knows once more, you know, a distinct particular thing has inherent to it distinction, but in being, and what I mean by that is like, for example, X, right? Inherent to X is the fact that it is not X or not A or not B. Um, and in doing so, that means inherent to its identity is the fact that it is contrasted with these other identities. If it wasn't contrasted with those other identities, if it wasn't the case that it was relational, uh, and wasn't distinct, it would collapse into everything else. But then it would have nothing. You couldn't actually talk about it because if something is everything, it's you can't predicate any particular thing about it as its own sort of identity as such. It would be sort of unintelligible or nonsensical at a certain point. You know, that's why you can never say, you know, being as such is particularizes being. It sort of cheapens it, so to speak. It doesn't actually get to the truth of it. I mean, Hegel talks about this in the Science of Logic as well. Um, but so
Sorry, what page are we on?
we are on 13. We have seven more to go. I should probably like
Mhm.
I should speed this up a little bit more. But
Well, to be honest, I don't really have that much time left because I have to go eat
okay,
something and then go to bed.
that's fine. I do have to cut like let's just stay for as long as you can. I'm gonna have to like cut through some more because unless you want to like do tomorrow too, because I need to get these out this week before I'm gone for a while. So
Yeah, I can do tomorrow. Let's do like maybe 15 more minutes.
okay, yeah, that's cool. Oh, so here's freedom of self-consciousness. Uh, this so now we're sort of done with like the master slave dialectic. He just kind of shows how both are independent, but in their independence, they're also inherently relational. That's sort of the big takeaway from that. In terms of the self-consciousness of two distinct individuals. Now he's going to talk about the freedom of self-consciousness. This is now another section. This is another movement within this chapter. When self-consciousness takes itself as the quote I, it takes itself as its own object, but does not take with it the distinction within itself as its own differentiation. It merely takes its own being, much like how the Lord takes itself as its own essential being and viewing otherness as unessential. Since self-consciousness sees itself as independent by virtue of its own work and servitude, it sees itself as a free moving and acting thing with its own independence. This shape of consciousness now takes itself as something that can be related to objects. And now that it sees itself as a free moving thing, it no longer thinks in mere pictures, but now in notions or concepts that have an inner logic, and therefore movement which moves with the free movement of self consciousness. It therefore takes the notion and the objects therein to be for itself. It says to itself, quote, "This is my notion, as is and is one with me, and essential for my communion with myself." This is the realization of self-consciousness's freedom. It knows itself as the being with its own notions and behind all notions, but at this stage, it doesn't know that it will have to go through its own inner manifoldness or of shapes to understand its essence. What that means essentially is that it does not yet understand that it must move through its notions in terms of thought. For now, it for now it merely knows that it knows itself, and that it knows that its notions are for itself and relate to the world of object. It is also important to know that its object is being for itself and being in itself for the immediate unity of self consciousness, meaning that it is truly distinct from it. But this distinction in itself has also inherently to it a relational nature to and for consciousness which thinks it as notion. So basically, when consciousness begins to understand itself as inherently relational, and also The fact that it's a singular self that exists amongst the sort of moving world. Uh, it no longer thinks in images per se. It now is able to sort of take things, create concepts with an inner logic and a sort of flow of understanding. Now, this is more developed. It's not as fully developed as it could be, but it is the beginning of notional thinking, right? I'll just use a super easy example. Um, well, I use this example before, so I'll stick with it. Let's take the moral notion: treat others the way you want to be treated. Well, why should I do that? Because, well, I want to be treated good, and if I want to be treated good, then I should treat others good. And um, so it's if something is true, it has to be universally true. Like that's the beginning of notional thinking, right there. And you also know that this is a sort of idea, right? It's the beginning of, oh, I have my own ideas, and in having my own ideas, it's sort of that are distinct from me. It's kind of like necessary for my consciousness to be itself. I couldn't be a consciousness without my own sort of manner of thinking per se. So, or a self consciousness without my own manner of thinking per se. Right? Because to be self conscious is to also know yourself as your own object as well. So, this is also, I mean, every point you're going to see is pivotal, of course, but this is sort of the beginning of notional thinking as such, in self consciousness and for the rest of the book. Um, when self consciousness takes itself as primary and its notions or own thinking reality as the true and good, this appears historically as Stoicism. So this is interesting. Uh, the Stoic mind is a self consciousness which seeks to withdraw from the moving world around it and back into itself. It takes any distinction from itself as negative and merely a distinction for itself. This difference is not really a difference, but only my difference within myself. This Stoic form of self-consciousness wants to escape relation to difference, and now we see a similar sense of existing for the Stoic that we saw in the Lord, who took himself to be essential and not having his existence through the bondsman, and vice versa. The Stoic form of thinking refuses to take its own existence in and through another, and seeks with its desire absolute freedom. Hegel states that this kind of thinking found in Stoicism could only ever come at a time of universal lordsmanship and bondage, which would be the catalyst for the desire to see the freedom of self from any other. He also states that it could only also ever occur in a culture which raised itself to philosophical thought to a certain degree. So this is interesting. He's also building a sort of continuity with a lord and bondsman sort of thing, because a lot of Stoic philosophers, as some of you may know, were slaves. I forget what's the one's name with an E. Now you probably know.
Stoicism, I think, was founded by Zeno of Citium, who was a Greek in the 3rd century BC.
Right, but there's also a very famous Stoic philosopher who was like a slave his entire life. What's his name? I can't remember the name. Somebody will know.
So basically, like he just used Stoicism to cope.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism. It's a coping
Yeah.
mechanism in a way, yeah. And I kind of talk about, I've actually kind of gone through something sort of similar. I think maybe many of us have. When we come across somebody who's antisocial, right? Somebody we don't like, or actually, let's even put it like this: an entire group of people we don't like.
Oh, it was Epictetus.
Epictetus, yes, that's who I was thinking of. When we come across a whole group of people, or maybe a whole culture of people we don't like that are antisocial, I'm actually writing an essay on this. It'll be a video soon, so I guess this is a little hint. Our first instinct for many of us is, oh, well, I just want to stay away from them, and I want to sort of like reflect inwardly and stay to myself. And I'm going to deny anything outside of myself because that which is outside of myself is a threat to my own existence, I feel. And I'm just going to stay, sort of secluded. And that's the Stoic mind. The Stoic mind's, in his fear and servitude of these slaves toward the Lord, they want to sort of say, well, he's not as real as me. I'm more, my mind and my existence is sort of superior to his in a way, and I'm gonna stick to myself.
Is that what the Stoics believed?
Well, and maybe not explicitly, but like at least implicitly in the sense like they they would say things like, uh, well, there's no point in caring about things that I can't control, and the only thing I can control is my mental well-being or my mental state, and so I'm going
But
to.
surely, like the object of philosophy is to learn how to live a good life rather than like the internal state. Like the internal state of the person and like the way a life is lived go together.
Yeah, of course, that's true.
So I mean, like it would have consequences in regards to how the person, the bondsman, acts if
Yeah,
he
well,
adopts stoicism.
the bondsman he kind of does in a way like what the Lord does to a certain degree in the sense that he puts primacy of himself uh, in the relation by sort of like uh, becoming secluded, asocial, so to speak. I only can control me. Uh, that's the only thing I can control to
So
a certain.
he fulfills his duties, but doesn't do anything more.
Doesn't do anything more, and he only in being a slave he feels he can't escape that, I suppose. And he also he's like, well, okay, my life sucks, but the one thing I have that they can't take from me is the sort of control over my emotions and my sense of like thinking or whatever. Have you seen the movie Shawshank Redemption? I'm sure
Yeah, yeah, I know
do you
the
remember
plot.
this? Yeah, the scene where I can't remember the guy's name, something Dufresne.
Dufresne, yeah, Andy
Yeah,
Dufresne.
I think Morgan Freeman says to him something like, the one thing they can take is your hope, or what you got in here. Like these prisoners who are basically slaves, right? Or at least they functionally are slaves. They end up sort of adopting this thing where they say to themselves, well, you might be able to control my outer physical life, but you cannot control my inner life, and I'm going to put primacy over that pure independent thing. Uh, and then they sort of become secluded, and they put inputting primacy on that, they deny otherness, and they sort of do the fallacy uh, of that we see present in the Lord, so to speak, uh, as well. They try to become unrelational. That's basically the problem of the Stoic. They want to become self-contained, uh, even though they're not self-contained because they're particular and relational. And for them, this self-containedness is a logical movement of consciousness back into itself. I have me. I can only control me. I can only control my inner life because I can't control my outer life. And because that's the fact, I'm going to deny the primacy or the sort of fullness of truth of things outside myself. You see this a lot with there's something Indian coded about it, to be honest, but I don't want to I don't wanna get the video taken down. Anyway, continuing here. This self-consciousness which denies distinction from itself therefore denies the outside world, and furthermore, when it takes itself as its own notion or as an I, which is its own thought of itself, in doing this denial of the world outside itself, it sees difference from itself as itself. And in this sense, whenever it contends with otherness, it is simply contending with itself, or it returns to itself through this otherness, which in the end it takes as its own. This is freedom in thought, which is not true freedom, but only the notion of freedom. It is not true freedom because in its denial of difference from itself, it has cut itself off from the fullness of life, which is where real freedom is found, and where the basis for its existence as a free agent is found. In cutting itself off from true otherness, its notion's content too, which has otherness within, is only taken as a superficial otherness, and its content, otherness, is given to it by self-consciousness. However, since its notion is denied, since its notion has denied, it should have said has denied otherness, its content becomes impotent, so to speak, in the sense that the notion is determinate, in that it has its own inner being and logic and path inherent to its own thinking through it that which thinking through it that occurs, which means that the otherness that is outside it, uh, outside its various shapes, is inherent to its determinate nature, or in the sense that the inner limits within the shapes of notion are limits imposed on it by true otherness, which is reached through moving outwardly from the limit found within a notion. So this is a little bit dense here. Let me just break this down. When you deny otherness, right? Now, of course, in denying otherness, it's not like you're saying nothing else exists besides me. It's more of just sort of like putting the primacy of yourself before everything else and saying it's kind of like unessential or, you know, uh, unnecessary, so to speak. But because the Stoic does have the notion, the Stoic knows that you can think through an idea or implicitly or logically, maybe without realizing, if you deny otherness, the otherness that you're giving the idea, because it becomes superficial in the sense that, like, well, I'm just giving it otherness. It's not, because I'm allowing it to have some sort of primacy rather than it actually having true relational distinct primacy to me as much as I do to it. So it sort of makes the freedom a superficial freedom. It's like, no, you're not actually free because you're denying the conditions for your own freedom, so to speak, by denying otherness in a way. And that's the problem. Uh, and so, like, Hegel kind of says, well, when the Stoic has an idea, because it is completely like he's cut himself off from the world. His idea, it's not actually
Well, like Stoicism isn't about cutting yourself off from the world. It's well, I mean, I'm kind of rehearsing this verbatim, but it's about the idea of living in accordance with nature, which meant aligning one's life with one's sense of reason and the rational order of the universe. So
right.
it is a holistic philosophy. It's not like solipsistic or isolated. It's about like fitting yourself in to a natural order.
But this is the problem. Because it claims that doesn't mean it's actually doing that, is what he would say. It may say, yeah, we're trying to live with nature. And actually, Nietzsche talks about this too, funnily, in saying that because its sense of nature is its own sort of conception, it's actually, its sense of nature is a picture thought, so to speak. It's not actually relating properly. It thinks it's doing that. And that's what he says. He says, well, in trying to integrate itself with otherness, because it has sort of put primacy on its mind in the relation, it actually it undermines what it's trying to do in doing that. And that's why, if it was to think dialectically, right, to take the otherness as truly other as much as it could, it would fully realize its freedom, and that's why its freedom is sort of cheap. What's actually, this is a really good thing that Nietzsche did point out, I think, regarding Stoicism. It's been a while since I've read that, but it's very relevant here. Nietzsche is saying, well, the Stoics, like, they don't actually understand nature. They just came up with an idea of, like, a lofty idea of nature that they hold, a picture thought, if you could call it that. And then they're trying to integrate that. They're trying to relate to this sort of, this like Frankenstein they've created. And that's why Hegel says their sort of inward reflection creates this sort of otherness that's superficial, that they've granted to, that they've given otherness to, but not really actually contending with it as
so
it is.
the way the Stoics imagine the natural order is actually a mental construct that bears little relation to reality.
Yes, that's the essential point being made here. And he's saying because of that, you're not actually dealing with real otherness like you think you are, and you don't have the real freedom that you think you do. That's the essential problem. And he's saying, no, you have to actually, if you want to actually contend with otherness and you want that freedom, you need to do the hard work of, well, thinking dialectically to get there. And but he's not being I'm kind of like defending Hegel like he's in court right now, but he's not being a dick about it. He's just saying, like, no, like, it's understandable because you're a slave, you're doing this like coping stuff, but like you're actually doing yourself a disservice when you think like that. And then you could get what you wanted if you took this extra logical step.
Well, the thing about Stoicism is it wasn't just a slave philosophy. It was adopted by elements of the Roman aristocracy
Certainly.
as well. And I guess like the root of the motivation for like the Roman elite, some of the Roman elite adopting Stoicism is like the conditions of like like the Roman Empire at its height, even though there's like this material abundance and like Pax Romana or whatever, like they feel life is fundamentally like materialistic and
Yeah.
shallow, and they're tired of being like served by their slaves all the time, and like they don't know what to do with themselves.
And in a
Uh,
certain way, that is a kind of form of like
it's
real
kind of
life.
like similar state to like kind of what we've been living through in the 21st century in a
Yeah.
lot of ways.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Even like the most, high up do suffer. Um, and it's no surprise that they think like this. There's something here I wanted to harp on more. Various shapes is inherent to its determinate nature, or in the sense that the inner limits within the shapes of notion are limits imposed on it by true otherness, which is reached through moving outwardly from the limit found within a notion. Yeah, so the reason I bring that up is because you actually see true otherness, true distinction through notional thinking or dialectical thinking, because when you think that way and you find this sort of contradiction or what is lacking, oh, you see it as a distinct thing. And in seeing it as a truly distinct thing from yourself, you then begin to see the freedom of yourself uh, in that sense. Freedom in the sense of like, oh, like I'm actually an independent thing. And I know I'm independent because I'm surrounded by other independent things, which are only independent by virtue of my independence. And I'm only independent by virtue of their independence. Um, and they too have an inner limitation, uh, and that inner limitation can only be found through working through the thing as the notion as it is, of finding its where it fails, so to speak.
Mm.
And in doing that, you end up sort of realizing a higher freedom of thought, because oh, I've now found this formula that sort of allows me to navigate my way through otherness and also back to myself again. And that's, of course, at the highest level, absolute knowing. But uh, so I'm going to go here. And I think, okay, after I read this page, maybe we could do 15 and then like page 15, because this is page 14. And then we can probably call it there and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
record.
that's fine.
We'll
Let's
record.
do page 15 and then we'll call it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Stoicism can speak of the content of thoughts, but since it is so inward, it can never speak of the truth as such, and has no account for the real nature to which its own content is derivative of, and it becomes contentless thought, since it never refers to real otherness, only inward otherness that is really not otherness, and is in the end tedious and impotent. Because it has cut itself off from the manifold experience of life and has only put primacy on its own thinking, which it takes to be true and universal, it therefore stunts its own development as consciousness in its development, as it needs otherness to shape and come to know itself. This is lifeless thinking because it is stuck within its own self and cannot truly move, which requires movement through otherness, right? Because in order for something to move from point A to point B, A and B are other from each other. And if you don't have that real otherness, you don't actually have development. You don't have movement. You don't have a way of contending with reality distinct from yourself. If you don't address it, if you don't recognize it, how could you? You're cutting yourself off from communion with it, so to speak. Anyways, continuing on. This withdrawal of consciousness is only the incomplete negation of otherness. This is because the Stoic mind, in its denial of otherness and particular determinateness, and thus only the affirmation of itself as taken to be true, has not yet negated otherness properly, in the sense it has not seen that this otherness is real, but also for itself. But that which this but that this real content, which is for consciousness, also has its own determinate nature, which relates to and for self-consciousness, which comes to know it through thinking as notion. That's kind of just what I was saying before. Um, so now we're introduced to another shape of this. This is a similar sort of thing. Skepticism is the realization of what Stoicism was only the notion of, doubt and denial of the world. The skeptic mind is the mind which actively denies and undermines the otherness around it. It is the independent infinite mind which moves through the independent otherness for which it is always present with, and is, as Hegel puts, magnitudes, for which the skeptic mind can deny in relation to itself. In Stoicism, the otherness which has denied was denied. In the sense, it was ignored and thought, it's thought as such, only stuck to itself. And the unessential character of otherness for Stoicism was otherness outside and indifferent to the Stoic mind. It's like a passive denial, so to speak. Skepticism now takes this otherness as concrete, as abstract thought, and actively undermines its reality. The negative, that is, the distinct nature of self consciousness, comes to know itself as real through this undermining of the other directly. It can say to itself, quote, I do not take this to be the case. And in saying this, it is saying that it is distinct from what it is denying, and thus has defined itself here as a negative or distinct thing. Stoicism took the same shape that was present in the Lord and Bondsman relationship of itself as essential and otherness as unessential. But it could never truly come to know itself as such in this indifferent denial. In skeptical self consciousness, however, since the differences are not merely abstract, but real concrete ones, it can take it as something which truly contrasts with itself. Therefore, the skeptical self consciousness does what desire and work could not do for the lower level self consciousness found in Stoicism, which only had differences for itself. Namely, that the differences are true differences, and consciousness, in its skeptical attitude toward it, begins to realize itself as self consciousness that is infinite and supersedes these differences, and that the differences which are truly other but also for self-consciousness shape self-consciousness in the sense that it is different from it when it is contrasted with a new form of otherness. The main point Hegel is making here is that the Stoic mind was passive denial of otherness or merely indifference, whereas the skeptical mind was active denial of otherness, and the otherness taken to be something truly outside the skeptic mind, which is taken to be unessential still, but also has true relational purpose for the skeptic mind, in the sense that in order to be skeptical, it must be truly directed at something which is being called into question or undermined. So, a couple things here, and I'm not this last little thing down here. I'll save that for tomorrow. But uh, skepticism is essentially doing what the Stoic mind was doing in denying otherness, but it's doing it in a more like explicit, active sense. For the Stoic mind, it was, it was putting primacy on itself, but in a very passive, just sort of like, I'm going to stick to myself and, you know, and you know, put primacy here. It was sort of like indifferent in a certain respect to the world around itself. Whereas a skeptical mind says, okay, I'm going to confront the world around myself, but I'm going to confront it with the intent to destroy it. Why? Because I see myself as the stable factor through the world around myself, and the world around me is changing, but I am not changing, is what it says to itself, and I am essential. Um, I am static, and static in the sense of like I am self same and everything else isn't self same. And because of this, I'm going to actively say you are, and by you, the skeptical mind would just mean the otherness as such. You are inferior. You are unnecessary. I transcend you. I supersede you. You
Thank
know,
you.
I am. You know, I am front and center, and you are, yeah, okay, you're here, but like you're not really anything. It's basically, the skeptical mind is looking at otherness and saying, objects like you look up and see a subject like me staring down at them. That's what it's saying to the world, essentially.
Well, were the skeptics nihilists?
Well, I mean, some of them were certainly, but when he says skeptics, it's also, I think of it in like an antisocial sort of sense. Like think of like an ankle biter guy who just wants to undermine everything. No, that's not true. Oh, that's stupid. No, that's not real. Like one of those kinds of people. Um, like it's almost like an attitude more than it is anything else. I think Hegel is also using skepticism and stoicism. Like he's talking of these things historically, of course, but he's also like speaking of them in like a sort of like psychological attitude as well. I think that's important to understand.
Hegel, the psychoanalyst.
Yeah, in a way, he is a little bit. What's a good example of the kind of skeptical mind thing? The Reddit atheist um, is obviously the perfect example, but even more so, that the most radical form of this is think of like your average like hardcore deconstructionist. They like a purely negative way of thinking. Hegel has alluded to this kind of stuff in the preface as well. I think he did refer to it as the skeptic mind, if I'm not mistaken. But he will talk about like
You
there.
mean like post-structuralism?
Well, yes, right. People who want to sort of deconstruct all prior structures. They well, it's old, it's not necessary, it's unessential. Let's tear it down and get rid of it. But oftentimes they don't want to build a new structure because they think that um, you know because structures will be taken down inevitably, that there's just no purpose in making them or recognizing them or
Well, there is a sort of structure. It's called the body organs.
well, certainly, yeah. I mean, that's like but you see, it's funny because like even that, right? That wants to escape. It's an attempt to escape um determinacy as much as possible in a way. Uh and that's kind of like the if there's any way you could define the essence of the skeptical mind in the sense Hegel is talking about, you could think of it as like the mind that just wants to sort of destroy everything but has no sense of like looking toward something positive, like something actual outside of that destruction. Um, it's almost demonic in a weird way, right? Uh, in the sense of just like, oh, like I want to take away from positivity, and uh, it's like how evil is a lack of the good in a certain respect. It's a similar sort of thing. It's a way of thinking that's obsessed with destitution, so to speak. As to quote T.S. Eliot, the destitution of all property and the inoperancy of spirit. Um, so yeah, that's the basically, and I love this section of Hegel because I'm like, oh yeah, he's just describing everybody that like the chud. This is like a lot of the times how they not I mean the chud will posit ideas, of course, they are ideological, but a lot of the times they embody this attitude, this transgressive, destructive attitude. Um, and I don't like that, to be honest. It's like you don't like they're not nice people to be around.
What were some negative experiences that you've had?
With chuds?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the video not before this one, but like my last like video essay like, thing, becoming American nationalist. I'm actually describing like what I think the future of like America will look like with the sort of like new rising sort of like Dugan Sneeko nationalism or whatever. Um, and it was more descriptive than it was prescriptive. I mean, I did say like, this is not the kind of nationalism that I envisioned when I first got involved in the scene. And then people like, they were upset at that because it shook them a little bit, and they were like, well, you're you're coping because your ideas suck or something, or like you guys are losing, and like
Why would you defend Sneeko?
I wasn't.
No, but like
Yeah.
why would they defend Sneeko? Like why would
Well, because they think Sneeko's going to destroy Zog. That's why.
yeah, they're
So
retarded.
yeah, you know. So like that's one example. I mean, I guess I've also just had like I know people who you see this, it's mostly on social media, of course, where like I'll say something. Everybody gets this too. This is not unique to me. You put out an idea and then like somebody just wants to criticize it, which is fine, and I'm more than welcome. I invite that kind of stuff. But it's never like criticism with in light of like trying to get to some higher truth. Like for example, like when you'll like question an idea I put forward, right? You're doing it in this with the intent to find something actually true outside of like maybe the shortcoming of that idea, right? But when it's just somebody who just wants to undermine something for the sake of undermining is a totally different attitude. It's this attitude that Hegel's kind of describing. It's one-sided being. It puts emphasis on the negative without recognizing that the negative only exists insofar as it's one with positivity. It needs positivity inherently for its existence, just like any particular thing needs otherness for its existence. So, yeah. And, here's a funny example too. I saw somebody. Somebody I follow. There's this account I follow on Twitter. I guess it's probably one of the larger accounts that I actually I don't know if he's bigger than me, but um, that I agree with. It's called the One Future Organization, and they're like whatever, like actual idealist types, Giovanni Gentile appreciators, and they were talking about Hegel in one of the posts, and like this chud just replies, he's like, Hegel, he was a libtard and he was a Prussian plant. It's like this is like I can't.
Mhm.
It's like this is like let's just say all that's true. Like, can you engage with the substance of the
I don't think
idea?
Hegel was a liberal. I
Yeah.
think he was like Prussian conservative.
Yeah, I think that's a fair, yeah. I think Hegel, like if Hegel was alive, during, like the 20s, I don't think he would have been NS. I think he probably would have been like he probably would have like well, I mean Hitler did like Bismarck, but he probably would have been more in line with like a sort of state socialism, uh, you know, of that
Like
kind of
he saw like the Prussian state as like the most developed state after
yeah.
the war.
Yeah, I want to make a video on how like I've written some stuff on how there is like freedom granted through the state. It's a really cool idea, and maybe I want to tie that into anarchism too. I mean, the Italian fascists also kind of talked about stuff like this as well. Mussolini has that quote: "Every failed what is it? Every anarchist is a failed dictator." And like that's true because well, a dictator is an anarchist in the sense that he recognizes no authority but his own, or at least he wants to recognize no authority other than his own. And an anarchist is the same way. The only difference you can really point to between the two is that a dictator wants to impose his will on others, and an anarchist would say he doesn't. But I would actually say the anarchist is happy to impose his will on others. He would impose his will on others he deems to be threatening to his ability to impose his will, just like the dictator
That
would.
in itself is ridiculous because I mean anarchism in the 19th and early 20th century is very violent. There was like a string of assassinations. So
Yeah, yeah,
they're perfectly happy with imposing their will on
yeah,
others, like up to and including killing them.
yeah. No, 100%. There's who is the? I see this guy post this anarchist guy every once in a while. I think he might have been Ukrainian, so you may know. He's kind of got like a really square like jaw.
Nestor Makhno.
Yes, yes. I don't know much about him, but um, so
What were you gonna say about him?
oh well, I'm just gonna say like I would imagine like when like somebody like him would have no problem imposing his will on like the Bolsheviks or something that he sees as like a threat to his ability to be sovereign, right? Um,
Well, like the way the Black Army functions, which was his army, the Black Army, it was basically a military dictatorship
yeah,
that despoiled the rich, like
yeah,
the local landowners. Did a lot of like rape and pillage. Uh, it was like an authoritarian stratocratic system.
right.
Uh, but I suppose like the cope is like oh like this is a necessary stage to realize like uh,
Yeah, I mean
that anarchist society.
all these systems have their like post hoc justification. I mean maybe some of it's true, but like whatever. Everyone's gonna do that. On that note, I'm gonna end the recording here.
Okay.